Hello and welcome to USAID Asia Counter-Trafficking In-Person Summit from Evidence to Action hosted by Winrock International. My name is Abigail and I will be your technical facilitator for today. To ensure that you have a smooth experience, I want to run through some of the features that we'll be using on Zoom. And it'll be just a moment before we get started. Your participation via chat is highly encouraged, and our team will work to acknowledge and address as many comments and questions as we can throughout today's session. To help us acknowledge you and your questions and inputs, please rename yourself to your name and organization by clicking the participants button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Hovering your mouse over your name, clicking more, and then rename. This meeting will be recorded. Please keep your camera off unless you are invited to speak in order to help everyone have a smooth connection today. Continue the conversation in the conference community on MS Teams or spark further conversations on social media using the hashtags WinrockE2A and Evidence to Action. Once again, you are in the session entitled Big Data. We are now ready to get started. I'm going to hand the floor over to your moderator, Tricia Ryan, who's the Evidence and Evaluation Technical Advisor for Winrock.
Thank you so much, Abigail, and thank you. Yes. Thank you so much, Abigail, and thank you so much to everyone for joining today. I think we have a great panel of speakers who are going to sort of dive into this very large topic of big data. And we want to make this session as interactive as possible. So please share your comments and questions in the chat. We're going to save at least 20 minutes at the end for audience interaction, but we'll also have time in between each of our panelists for you to ask clarifying questions and introduce discussion topics that we may take up a little bit later. We are going to be hearing first from Shinyi Duan at Liberty Shared. She'll be followed by Davina Durgana from Walk Free, and then Greg Vandervink from Novametrics. So without further ado, please take it away, Shinyi. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen, which hopefully... Oh, sorry, the spotlight has just changed where my screen share has. Do you see my screen?
I can see your screen. Great. Thanks, Shinyi. Okay.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I'm Shinyi Duan and I'm from Liberty Shared. And today I'll be speaking to you about sort of a foundational topic in any kind of big data. It's about sort of the assumptions we have to make when we're talking about data in general, and especially when we are talking about using data at scale, big data. And my presentation is focused on sort of the assumptions and misconceptions and then ways forward as the field. And essentially my presentation has two parts. I'm gonna keep it really on schedule so I don't make sure take any time away from my other panelists. So I might skip some of this, but the first part is about why tip data in general is so difficult to work with when we want to make conclusions. And this is not unique to trafficking. And the second part is my bulk of my presentation. So essentially the foundations of tip data, honestly, this is the foundations of any data, is that what we see at the end is generally this green box, right? We kind of get the documents, we read the policy implications and all that, but all of data comes out of a data generating process. And I think if you're not in the field of academia, this is not something you think about. But my presentation is actually really going to be focused on what is the data generating process inside trafficking, in the trafficking field in large. And then after data is generated, let's say in the world, there's an engine that generates it, then we need to collect it. That's also an area where people are not paying enough attention. And a lot of times data collection can introduce a lot of biases, and I put it in quotes, I don't mean in the technical sense or anything like that, but I just mean it introduces issues. Then I think my colleagues will probably be talking about, doing sort of modeling, data science, interpretation, and all that good stuff. But honestly, my talk is not even going to touch that just because of limitations. So I'm really going to talk about like, how do we do the first 2 bits? And then what are some of the issues that we're running into? So the bulk of my talk will be on going through what I call these assumptions and misconceptions. And due to time constraints, so this is going to be a web publication. We're doing it with Winrock. It's going to be available at a link. I will show it again, vcms.app/pub/data and tip. That's where we currently also have the recommendation form. So if you have recommendations as you hear this presentation about how our field can really address this, feel free to submit them in. You can make it into the publication and we can cite you if you want to be included. But essentially my 6 assumptions are that a lot of people assume it's easy to identify trafficking victims in person or in data. People assume that NGOs and frontline organizations are likely to assist a wide variety of trafficking victims and that there's some kind of representativeness in the data that gets generated by the field. People might assume that trafficking is a global problem, surely it is, so that we can easily compare data across international contexts for comparative analysis. People might assume that if we have enough victim assistance data, we'll know the trends and patterns for successful intervention in industry, law, enforcement, and policy. People also assume that we can easily gauge the amount of trafficking that's, there's more or less over time. And people also assume over time that trafficking, because it's this quote discrete event in somebody's life, someone's trafficking data will somehow show these discrete events in a person's life data and so forth. So these are my assumptions, and essentially our work has shown that in general, it's problematic to make all of these assumptions, and that in data, in reality, and practicality, most of these just don't hold up in our experience. Due to time constraints, I'm only gonna really talk about the first 3, maybe even the first 2, depending on how this timing goes, but you can read all about it when the publication comes out. So a 20-second intro on what VCMS is. This is where some of the data I'm gonna go through comes from. VCMS is a victim case management system that Liberty Shared built for NGOs who are frontline organizations who are assisting survivors use to track their cases. We're now have about 87 NGOs on board. These are just the stats, we're in about 25 countries, we have 7 languages, we have 250 active users at any given time, about 600 users that have signed up, and about 40,000 cases now. This graphic is a little out of date. And this data also goes into CTDC, which is the IOM database that they maintain on survivor data, but it's heavily anonymized by the time we give it to them based on their requirements. Some of the data you'll also hear about comes from Freedom Collaborative. If you're not familiar with it, it's essentially an NGO platform that NGOs can join and share what they do, share resources, and also participate in things like webinars, which is probably what we're most well known for. And we have housed a bunch with USAID and Winrock, as you can see. So that's also free and open to share if you're a professional working in the area. So this is the data, some of the data we'll be talking about in my presentation. Let's look at assumption number 1, right? It's easy to identify victim in trafficking data, victim in trafficking in person or in data. So in VCMS, as you know, this is now victim data from NGOs. We have about just even something very simple. So most of you know that if the person is marked as trafficking or haven't been trafficked or exploited in our system, then they should have a method of coercion for their case. And this is based on the Palermo protocol that the trafficking has, the means, method, and mode. So this is essentially what we're saying is, what is the method of coercion? And as you can see, this is essentially, I pulled all the cases. I pulled all the cases that are meant to be exploited or otherwise. And so you can see intercepted, unknown, at risk. But as you can see, a lot of them actually have unknown or no methods of coercion recorded, even though there's 11,000 cases that are meant to be, quote, trafficking cases. And this is not because NGOs are not doing a great job. A lot of times, maybe historical data, they don't even write that down, or they don't bother writing it down in a structured way. Maybe it's in the case notes, maybe it's just in the NGO staff member's head, and they're like, oh, I know that case really well. But as you can see, what happens is, once we get down to details and we say, well, is there a lot of psychological coercion? Is there a lot of physical coercion that's happening in cases? A lot of times we don't even know that information. And you might even throw into questions, well, is this a really trafficking case? Because method of coercion is pretty key to that identifying trafficking. And I have to tell you right now, it's not clear. We just don't have that piece of information. Similarly, if you're thinking for, let's say, people under the age of 18, if they're in a situation they don't want to be in, you don't even need a method of coercion because they don't have the age of consent by international standards. So to know if somebody's truly under the age of 18, we would need their date of birth to calculate their age. Not just a guesstimate of their age, but actually knowing their age. And as you guys have heard from the refugee world, like age identification is really tricky. I can do a whole talk about just getting people's birth dates in TIP. It's really difficult. But as you can see, this is actually our live data. This is connected to our data stack. We have a smattering of age distributions for the clients, like, maybe victims, survivors. And there's obviously some data quality issues. There are people who are over 110. That can't be true, very small amount. But what is concerning to me, at least, is that, and certainly not tooting our horn, are doing a great job, because this is really a problem with the data that we have this 20,000 block that where the birth date is unknown. So there is another field that the NGO can put a approximate birthday. So they can say, oh, this person's 18, probably, or 19, but I don't know their birthday. And as you guys who work in international context know, so many times people in Cambodia and Thailand, they don't know their actual date of birth. They don't have identification. They don't have a passport. We take it for granted in the West that we have all this great infrastructure. So it's actually really quite difficult for the NGO to know that information if the survivor doesn't know it, but they might not even think it's that important to trace it down because they're like, oh, this person is of age. And we'll be like, well, how do you know that? Well, they seem like it. And honestly, nobody really knows their age, and doing sex work at 16, 17 is really not a problem in my country. It's not trafficking. Like, we have heard these statements. And if we really think about bringing it down to the Palermo Protocol, these lack of data really becomes a problem about how we would do identification, because we don't even know if we need method of coercion or if that person is truly consenting. So that's just another example. Sorry, I'm just trying to keep in time. Okay, I'm probably only gonna go through two. So the second assumption.
Yeah, sorry, I think we have time for one more assumption, and then hopefully we'll get lots of questions and continue the discussion.
Okay, so my next assumption is that frontline organizations assist the same kind of assist a wide variety of survivors, and that we have data that's representative. So this is Freedom Collaborative data by organization registration. As you can see, for organizations that are registered, and Liberty Share came out of Asia, we actually have more North America organizations, and most of the organizations, they can choose multiple forms of focus, but you can see the overwhelming amount choose sexual exploitation and commercial exploitation of children, followed then by forced labor. And you can see the distribution in terms of countries. So both geographically and both on what NGOs are dedicated to working on, they're mostly focused on sex trafficking, and they're mostly in places like North America, maybe in other smattering of places in terms of actual number. And this means that they're not really gonna see the same number of labor trafficking victims in places that there's just fewer civil society. And if you look at, this is in VCMS data, same idea. This is across the entire data set. We have, the breakdown of male versus female clients and how they escaped the trafficking situation and who they got help from before getting referred to NGOs. So I just really want to quickly show you, when we look at female victims who are female, the path to assistance looks very similar to the overall map. A lot of them escaped and ran. They got assistance from all these different types of groups, including local law enforcement. And you can see law enforcement assistance is a method in which they escape. But if we look at, let's say, male, sorry, my browser is just a bit slow. And I'm gonna just run it. What that looks like is actually gonna be quite different. And essentially, a lot of them will not be able to get the same kind of, and I can show this in Asia specifically, where it's just fewer lines. I realize for the paid purpose of this, you're probably seeing these tiny lines and trying to figure out what's happening. Let's say you're a male victim in Asia, you actually have never really gotten, until very recently, you have this one person who got law enforcement assistance. But essentially, if you're a male victim in Asia, you're not gonna be picked up by law enforcement to help you. You might be arrested, and then from there, you might get into a process, but local law enforcement is not gonna help you. And law enforcement data is a type of frontline data as well, right? So this is just goes to show you not all frontline organizations are interacting with. I'm going to skip the media monitoring data. And essentially, I'm just going to put the recommendations up front, but we want to encourage and get more people trained in the front line in terms of data capture and primary data capture to be more consistent, and for us to read more widely and quantitative as well as qualitative data. And you can submit your own recommendations about how we can remedy some of these issues in the link I mentioned. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shinyi. That was really, really fascinating. And I wish we had time to go through all of the assumptions. So I really hope that all of the participants will take your invitation and weigh in, because I think this work is really important. We have a minute or two for questions from the audience, if anybody has any now, before we move on to our next speaker, Davina, who I think is going to address some of the points you just made about assumptions and how they can be made more explicit in the work that gets done. So I haven't seen anything from the audience. Oh, yes, Sophie Zinzer. Could you, Hermes or Abigail, could you please unmute Sophie? Or Sophie,
Hi.
could you type?
Thanks so much, Trisha, and thanks to me. I actually work in Hong Kong, and on this issue with migrant domestic workers trying to find sort of tech solutions. So very interested in this. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit more about how you guys track data in Asia. Are you looking at NGOs that work specifically on exclusively sex trafficking, or do you also work on like forced labor trafficking and like construction or sort of like other sectors as well in hard to reach areas? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. We don't explicitly look for organizations in sex trafficking. It just happened that's the field as it is. And actually in Hong Kong, one of our main VCMS partners is Helpers for Domestic Workers. I guess used to be, so they're actually domestic worker oriented. And if your organization is interested in using it, you can absolutely reach out to us. But no, we don't just look at sex trafficking, but in places that where we try to develop, let's say labor trafficking, like in Malaysia, they're just not a deep NGO field. So it's really, really difficult, and labor generally is less funded than sex trafficking in the anti-trafficking movement.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Lindsay Kennedy about privacy protection and during data sharing and collaboration, and asking how we can ensure that re-identification and leaks don't take place. And I don't know if you want to tackle that now or pin it for later.
Let's pin it for later. I just don't want Davina to run out of time. I know she has a panel right after this. But yes, great question.
So I will come back to that at our Q&A section at the end. But Davina, could you please, I know you have a question for Shinyi, and then can you transition right into your piece?
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Shinyi. I really appreciate your clarification of the assumptions, right? Because I think there's a lot of this work of how the sausage gets made that needs to be made more explicit. And I think asking these questions and making this more transparent is going to help a lot of our stakeholders truly understand some of the limitations of not just the data, but also the policy recommendations that might follow from them. The one thing I actually thought was really fascinating, and I thought was worth clarifying from your presentation so far, was especially given that the majority of organizations do focus, that are captured in this data set, do focus on sexual exploitation and CSEC, and that the birth dates are unknown for so many of the victims. It actually followed to me logically, and I was wondering what you thought about this, that we would also be missing a lot of information on coercion, because of course, as you know, that's not a requirement for minors in that situation. So actually, when I was looking at what you were sharing, it made sense to me that if a lot of the organizations are already focused on CSEC, they wouldn't really be wasting a lot of time getting information on methods of coercion if that wasn't a criteria for the designation of a trafficking victim.
Yeah, great question. So in the system itself, under method of coercion, one of the top choices is not needed, minor. So if they selected that, they're not in that unknown analysis. But that said, we actually also did quite a lot of historical data migration for organizations. They came, they already had a spreadsheet. Yeah. And honestly, they probably weren't keeping spreadsheets with a column on coercion. As you know, you've probably seen organizations that, with a column on their birthday perfectly. They have a bunch of notes and say this person was clearly 7, clearly 15, clearly whatever, and they just didn't want to be there. Did they bother to go back and split it into variables? Probably not. And that's also where we're seeing a lot of missingness, unfortunately. But yeah, they could have chosen saying minor, no need coercion. They just didn't choose that for if that was the case. Yeah, we just don't know, unfortunately.
Thanks so much. Okay, so with that, I think we'll probably jump right into my session. I know there's another question. Do you want to take that, Jinyu, while I'm getting this set up, or do we want to put that in for later?
I will read the question at least. Okay, let's, according to
chat, I think it was about data protection.
And I just
Okay.
want to note that I'm keeping track of all of these questions. Please keep them coming in. And if we don't have time while our speakers are still going, we'll try to get to everything at the end.
Okay, we will do that at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
All right, thanks, good. All right, so we have approximately 6 minutes, and I will make sure to get that done for you guys. Trisha, are we still on time for that, or do I need to go faster? Okay, great. So I'm Davina Dragana from Walk Free, and effectively what we're going to be talking about is, like Shinyi mentioned, we are going to be addressing the reality of using this type of data in our field. There are so many limitations, there are so many assumptions, and more importantly, what Shinyi and others have done to contribute data in this way, to try to develop consistent to the success of our long-term efforts to track and identify data. A lot of what we do at Walk Free is, of course, generating our own data collection efforts through national surveys, and I'll talk a lot about MSC, multiple systems estimation here. But to be honest, this is very cost intensive. So what that means is that there are very few organizations that can continue to contribute the type of resources that we will. And when we do that, it doesn't address all of the areas of interest that many organizations have. So the fascinating thing to consider is that when an organization is funding this type of research, our research questions are primarily going to guide that function. What we've seen is that a lot of other groups will then, of course, use the information that we publish and make transparently available for their own purposes. But remember, unless you're starting at that foundational level that Shinyi talked about, a lot of this is not going to necessarily meet your needs perfectly. And this is kind of where this ground level data collection efforts really critical, because this is almost the democratization of access to data inputs on this. And I think it's something we need to all work as a field to encourage to the extent that we can. So Shinyi mentioned data sparsity issues, and we find that has to be addressed. That's something that we're all concerned about, especially the migration of legacy systems that don't necessarily have all the same fields that we really require. And actually part of our multiple systems estimation program with the UN Office on Drugs and Crime that I'll talk about actually incorporates quite a bit of intentionality in terms of capacity building for these data collection systems now. So I'll mention that a little bit. Also, it's really important to acknowledge, like Jinyi's raising very important limitations of the Counter-Trafficking Data Collaborative's data system, but they are also guiding a lot of our efforts at the UN level. So one of the things that we're finding is that our accountability on reaching Sustainable Development Goal 8.7 by 2030 is going to be very difficult to achieve unless we can hold all of our actors, these are state governments, these are multinational companies, everyone to account in terms of how we're doing that. And the way to hold them to account is through some form of measurement of progress. And so data collection systems, understanding the importance of data collection is critical from a policy perspective as well as a technical one. The other thing, and I say this in my capacity as not just a senior statistician at Walk Free, but also vice chair of Statistics Without Borders of the American Statistical Association, and just a little plug that we do provide pro bono statistical assistance to NGOs all around the world. So please get in contact with me if you have any interest in that kind of service. It's run through the American Statistical Association. But one of the things we function on the basis of, and I think both Greg and Jinyi can really appreciate this, applied statistics is not theoretical statistics. We have to make a lot of concessions in terms of how we apply statistics in the field and the kind of data that we're comfortable using. It's not a clinical environment. It's not a perfect environment. So that's kind of where I mentioned this whole thing about the perfect being the enemy of the good. It's really important to remember that we have to make incremental progress as a field. And to do that, we need to be able to use what we have available. And again, this is still a huge accomplishment, Jinyi. So you should be very, very proud of what you guys have contributed and developed in terms of a data architecture, even if it's not perfect, because I know how frustrating it can be being the person leading a lot of these efforts and then seeing some of the shortcomings, and especially how some of our colleagues in the field might interpret that information. But you've certainly done something very important, especially for the future, the long-term future of our field. Sorry. So multiple systems estimation, you may have heard of it before, but effectively what we do is we work with national governments on data collected by those governments, specifically identified by lists. So you might have a law enforcement list, you might have a service provider list, you might have an immigration list, and then we compare how likely it is that specific victims will appear on multiple lists. Now, this is a newer form of estimating trafficking victims. It has been used by the Human Rights Data Analysis Group in other settings, and we've used it in the last 6 years in several countries, but we've also really improved our methods. So to that point, there's been a forum debate actually just published yesterday in the Journal of Human Trafficking that kind of outlines effectively a major response to some common critiques in the field of the method and how we've actually addressed it. So normally this isn't something that we would do. It's taken almost a year to pull the 6 academics that work together on this response together. But it was important because we, unlike many other applications of statistics, work directly with stakeholders that may not have the same technical backgrounds. And so it's very difficult for them to judge on its face of the value or the merit of a method without understanding kind of the full picture. So one of the things that we thought was really important was to be very transparent about how the method has evolved since its initial exercise in the United Kingdom, which, as a summary, some of the things that we've improved include covariate information. So that includes age groups, industries of exploitation. It includes the genders of a lot of the victims. And so we can create sub-estimates along with some of the Sustainable Development Goal indicator requirements for that at the UN level. So all of this to say that we also have a special edition coming out soon in crime and delinquency that is going to go into very technical detail about how these methods have improved and how we've addressed common obstacles from the earlier stages of our joint program to the later ones. And the UN Office on Drugs and Crime will also be publishing a manual on MSC and how to apply this on the basis of our program. So all of this to say that as academics, I think what Xinyi raises is really critical. You know, there are serious limitations and many, many assumptions built in at every stage of this research process. And the part that a lot of our stakeholders might touch might only ever be that very top part of the pyramid. But understanding a little bit more of how we've gotten there is so important to understanding just how you want to apply that from a public policy or an intervention perspective. And I think that's also a burden on us as researchers to be more communicative, more forthcoming, and to be as explicit about that as we can. All right, thanks guys. I think that's almost exactly 6 minutes if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you so much, Davina. And yes, that was remarkably well timed. Did anyone have any clarification questions for Davina before? Again, we're going to lose Davina a little bit early, but we will make sure to save time for questions before she leaves. I don't see any yet, but you still have time. In the interim, Xinyi or Greg, did you have any? Greg, we're going to hear from you in just a minute, but if either of you had any burning questions or discussion points, please feel free.
And just a plug, you can also catch us on our next panel. Immediately after that.
I'm really looking forward to it. It's on
vulnerability assessment.
Yes, on assessment. So about using some more of these data. I don't see any.
I would love to hear from Davina. This might be better for later about the large scale surveys, because I'm just, as you guys know from my presentation, I love primary data collection. I want to hear the efforts that are going on, and certainly love to hear you talk more about that and how we as other people in the field might get access to the kind of that data. But I feel like that's a bigger discussion point, so just raise it.
Absolutely, but I think it's also worth just if I have a minute to even just mention some of that. So as you know, Walk Free has been collaborating with the ILO on the global estimates of modern slavery, and so at this point that represents 54 nationally representative surveys that we collect in conjunction with Gallup World Poll. But it gets better because we're also trying to find really hard to reach populations that are not easily accessible through Gallup World Poll partners. And of course, with COVID, there have been some limitations in terms of face-to-face surveys and other things. So this is going to be quite an interesting year in terms of how we've overcome some of those common challenges and also what we can do to compare modalities. So if it means that in some countries where we may end up doing face-to-face surveys, telephone surveys as opposed to face-to-face surveys, because we have so many similar countries, we can actually compare design effects across those modalities. So that's going to be really interesting because the cost implications, as you know, for a telephone survey are significantly more, like they're much lower. The costs are much lower than they are for face-to-face surveys. So if we can understand a bit more of the difference in terms of how that's been affected, COVID's another element, like an intervening variable that we all will have to account for in our research, and it also affects multiple systems estimation, believe it or not, because of course, governments are much less likely, as you know, with law enforcement especially, to be identifying victims when there's less interaction in the public sphere. So certainly, I think COVID will affect a lot of our research, but I'm very excited to just see how some of these changes in modality that we may not have ever actually done, we would not have intentionally have done in the past, may actually be something of a blessing in disguise in terms of how we do that. And of course, we publish our methodological documents. We also look at, we'll be looking at how we can share some more detailed breakdowns. And of course, beyond the global estimates of modern slavery, which will report regional totals, we'll also use that information as the basis of the Global Slavery Index, which will then provide more detailed information as much as we can share. So, and then of course there's a bit we'll talk about in the vulnerability session next, but there's a little bit of extrapolation when we don't have data in all of those countries. But to the extent that we can, since our survey research program is expanding so much, we actually are getting more and more countries that have direct data. And also with multiple systems estimation, we can address that in developed countries too. So it's kind of interesting.
Thank you very much, Davina. We have a really interesting question for you that I'm going to press pause on for now, which I hate doing. I love all of this back and forth from the audience, but I want to make sure that we have a few minutes for Greg and that then we have, again, the full 20 minutes for more interaction. So Greg, are you ready to take the stage?
Sure, yes, thank you. I was, as Davina was making that statement, I was thinking about this issue of assumptions, and I'm going to step back a little and talk about, in general, big data, the role of big data, and what I see as its sort of emerging role in terms of the future for CTIP and CTIP research, and some of the work Novometrics has been doing on evaluating vulnerability to human trafficking. We started out. Novometrics began with doing vulnerability to violent extremism, mostly with the defense and intelligence communities. And so we're fairly new to this field in terms of human trafficking. But the idea of the opportunities that now exist for using big data and that bringing along new analytical approaches that can be applied to evaluating vulnerability and applying that to human trafficking is very exciting. So we have this, but as Davina pointed out, you have to make a lot of assumptions. And as a matter of fact, we have this saying at Novometrics that we, as data analytics, one of the things I think is very important is to have this collaboration between subject matter experts and the data analytics people who know the advanced methodologies, because we have this statement that we use statistics like a drunk uses a lamppost. It's for support, not for illumination. And the idea is ultimately you have to see it in the data. So I just couldn't. I thought of that as we were bringing it along. I'm sharing my screen here. I'm not sure if you're getting this. I'm going to go into presentation mode here and just show you a couple of slides and to make sort of the general point of what I think are some of the opportunities for big data and how where I think are some exciting new areas we should be thinking about. So can people see my screen?
Yes, thank you, Greg.
Okay.
But Greg,
So
I think you
if
might be in presentation mode. It might be easier if you're in, because we can see like,
is
yeah.
Is that better? Okay, okay. So thank you. If you look at the general evolution in any, the epistemological evolution of any kind of topic, this is sort of the evolutionary process, and it's also been true for CTIP. You know, of course, you start out with site visits, and at site visits, you kind of collect anecdotal information, which is great because it gives you ideas. It helps you formulate hypotheses, which you can use to test. But, you know, as we say, the plural of anecdote is not data. It does create ideas and hypotheses to test, but it's not something you really want to be basing policy on or setting priorities. So the next step is generally to try and formalize that and have it in a more representative sample. And typically people use case studies, which are more formal methods of evaluation. Then we move on, sort of the next evolutionary step is surveys. And we can have an argument about this. But I think, you know, in the past, the aid and development community has kind of followed this concept of actually the medical community looking at a sort of the RCT type model, et cetera. And, you know, we've had these terms that are, you know, where we've been looking to make sure whatever we find in one area has transportability and scalability. And I think this old model of sort of modeling after this, we're now realizing that while this is an outstanding model for testing the efficacy of a vaccine, it's not necessarily one that can accommodate all the variables associated with, you know, assuming that an intervention that works in one area is going to work in a completely different sociocultural environment. And I think this is what has led to a lot of the frustration, in fact, you know, in a lot of the investments in aid and development. So, you know, in general, then the next evolutionary step is to move to an ecosystem model, one that looks at all the parameters. And you know, this is, as we see with, you know, as we see with CTIP interventions, we're no longer looking for that silver bullet, that one size fits all, that thing that's going to work in the village in Kenya can be then, you know, scaled up to work throughout the world. We're realizing that what we have is more of an ecosystem model with the concept of geographically targeted interventions that are customized for each location. And what's exciting about this is these can be faster, cheaper, and more effective type interventions that are designed to go into an ecosystem that supports, let's say, human trafficking, because that's what we're talking about, and look at how we can disrupt that ecosystem so it is no longer hospitable to human trafficking, and look for the fastest, most efficient way to do that. Now, this, of course, modeling an ecosystem is essentially big data. And because we're looking at all the socio-cultural, economic parameters and indicators that allow us to characterize that ecosystem and looking for the underlying causal relationships that are supportive of human trafficking and how we can disrupt that ecosystem so it's no longer hospitable to that. This also is, of course, more focused if we look at the traditional 3P paradigm of human trafficking. This, of course, is more targeted towards prevention because we're looking to reduce the number of victims of human trafficking. In the ecosystem model, if the ecosystem can support a predator and you remove the predator, but you don't also alter the ecosystem, then what happens is another predator you know, will arrive into that ecosystem. So it's also about you know, disrupting the ecosystem so it's no longer hospitable to human trafficking. So this is sort of an exciting way that we see as a way of addressing, you know, the future of addressing and identifying geographically targeted interventions that can be faster, cheaper, and more effective. In terms of big data and where, you know, in thinking, I was asked to look at kind of the big picture. This is a great opportunity, and I think it's a very exciting time to be involved in human trafficking because of the evolution that's currently taking place in our analytical approaches. And also the fact that, as the previous speakers have said, there's not only vast amounts of digital data that are available, but we're also at the same time, you know, seeing machine learning and computing capability. I went, and I was asked to sort of look at what would be the 3 kind of hot areas for future growth. Of course, this is a talk, so you'll always have to have 3. So here are my 3. One, and I'll show you a quick example of this, is I think a future area for breakthrough is the integration of remote sensing data with survey data. We can really enhance and leverage the surveying data if we start integrating it with remote sensing data, taking advantage of all the data we have for super high resolution data on demographics, access to markets, income levels, all of that, which we can now go and acquire at very high resolution with remote sensing data. The other is applying more advanced data analysis and analytical approaches to the data we already have. Davina touched on this. We've all been in a lot of, USAID has hosted several surveys on survey methodologies. The survey methodologies are continuing to improve and getting very, increasingly more sophisticated, and as you've heard. I would argue, however, that our analysis of the data is still what we would say largely remains first order, and that there is a vast amount of data. I don't believe at this point we are data limited. I think there's a vast amount of data that is out there to which we can extract a lot of additional information by just using some more advanced data analysis. And then the third topic, which, if you look at, some people use the 3 V's, the 4 V's, or the 5 V's of big data: volume, variety, velocity, veracity, et cetera. I really think I remember Hans Bethe made the observation that the greatest breakthroughs in science occur from where you put the coffee pot. And data fusion is in many ways where you put the coffee pot. It brings in different types of data, and that's where we always see large breakthroughs in science. So the one I'm actually most excited about is this concept of data fusion and the integration of different types of data and the broader applications to other topics. And we all know that the data collected, and I'm assuming we'll hear about this in our next session, but data collected for health surveys or economic surveys or educational surveys, all of that can be used to evaluate vulnerability to human trafficking, improve our understanding of human trafficking, and help us develop these geographically targeted interventions. And just to quickly conclude with a couple of examples.
I'm sorry to cut you off, Greg, but I do just want to make sure that we save time for questions. We're down to 15 minutes remaining in the session.
Sure. Okay, so let me just give you this. I'll just do this one example. Here's something we're looking at for a project we're doing on vulnerability to human trafficking in Laos. There's a railroad coming in connecting Laos to China. And so we can, just looking at very high resolution data, we can see where this railroad is coming in, where the stations are coming in. By integrating this remote sensing data with high resolution demographic data, that's from remote sensing. We're going down to 3 meters here and looking at access to markets, educational institutions, and all that. We can sit here and prioritize and come up with a number of girls at various age levels who will be exposed to increased vulnerability to child marriage and other forms of human trafficking because of this railroad that's coming through. So this is just sort of one quick example of what I said of this idea of both kind of data fusion and the aspects of integrating remote sensing with the tabular data that we have from surveys and education.
Thank you so very much. And if we have time for further examples, I'm sure that people would love to see them. I know I would. And thank you to all of our speakers. We have a number of remaining questions, and I hope that you will keep submitting them into the chat. We also have some observations, but I wanted to go back to a question from Sophie Zinzer that's directed toward Davina, since we are losing Davina in about 8 minutes. So Davina, do you mind recapping the question for everyone and
Yeah,
answering?
thanks, Trisha. So Sophie raises a great question that I think we're all encountering. So what do we do when governments are resistant to providing the data that we know may reflect a little bit poorly on some of the policies they may have? And I think the migration and immigration challenge in particular is resonant with everything that we've seen in the United States and in many other countries. We're also doing a lot of research on how this is working in Colombia with the context of Venezuela. And it's certainly very difficult, but remember, governments are not our only stakeholders in getting this data. Working with governments is excellent. The multiple systems estimation program, as I mentioned, is done in full cooperation with the national governments. But often that's not amenable. Most countries, particularly ones that may have any form of state-imposed forced labor or any other incentive to not be transparent with this information, would exactly follow the tact that Sophie's describing, where they would be really resistant to sharing that data, to being transparent about that data. And so I think her question about how multilateral organizations can influence these thinking shifts are really critical. In my opinion, I've been working very closely on our multilateral engagement, and we find that it does have an impact. There's a lot of pressure that can be laid to bear, particularly when we call into question self-reported data. The governments and countries should not be able to necessarily just self-report on their own progress and their own prosecution and other rates, and just for that to be taken at face value without any kind of actual independent interrogation or validation. Additionally, what I would say is that, I've been really impressed with what the private sector can do. The kinds of requirements that funding organizations now have, which many governments that are in these situations do require international funding agreements. And so from the perspective of funders, I think it's really compelling to have this requirement about transparent data sharing and to demonstrate that, we want to make policy that's based on evidence. And that's something policymakers around the world are calling for. And so I think integrating both the receipt of funding with transparent data sharing, as long as, there are adequate data protection features in place, which is a huge, huge caveat. I think that there's a lot of pressure we can put to bear on more difficult governments to work with that compel a lot of groups to look more carefully at how they treat and prioritize data sharing, particularly on a population like migrant workers that are very difficult to identify in the first place. Another way we hold them to account, again, is through private sector. Those are civil society, private foundations, even national, multinational companies. And we look at doing that research ourselves in countries where we're just not going to get government compliance. And that is more difficult. It's very challenging. The Arab states, for example, the Gulf countries, are very resistant to allowing permitted research to happen that way. So we can't actually do a lot of our Gallup surveys there. But then we look at auxiliary populations that may have relocated and trying to become very creative about how we analyze the migrant worker experience.
Thank you. Did Shinyi or Greg, did you want to respond to Davina or to that question in general? And not to put you on the spot, because we have plenty more questions that I can pull from.
No, I think we ought to move on to the more questions from the audience.
Sure. I wanted to go back to a question from earlier that I flagged as something to go back to, and it was directed to Shinyi, but I would imagine that you'd all have possibly different, but important perspectives on this, but about how to ensure privacy protection during data sharing and collaboration, and what the best way forward is that. And of course, as you get further away from the primary data collection, you generally have more de-identification going on. But so Shinyi, if you'd like to speak to that first, please. And then if either Greg or Durgana, you have, Davina, you have something to add, please do.
Yeah, I can take that certainly on the VCMS perspective. So I know the session wasn't really about, didn't give you enough context on VCMS, but essentially it's not an open system where anyone can just sign up and start inputting victim data. They sign a data agreement with us first, and they have to understand the steps that you need to take to get informed consent and data protection policies that are coherent with their local jurisdiction laws on data protection. And this varies widely by jurisdiction. So our NGOs often need training even before joining, just to understand what the requirements are in terms of data governance, which is why one of my recommendations is we need to start training frontline workers as part of the data infrastructure. Data science doesn't just happen at the level where people are running models and it's like really cool output. It's all the way down, and we don't treat them like knowledge workers. And this is sort of some of the consequences of why the infrastructure is weak. But to the question is, first, the NGOs are the first line of defense. It's their data. They're the person who's custodying it for the victim or for the survivor. And we are a provider of platform. That said, the NGOs don't right now explicitly are able to share data. They can only share information if they explicitly say, I want to share this case with another NGO that I trust. There's a manual process in which they can do that, and we can facilitate that. But in general, they see only their own data. Not everyone's seeing like the entire pool that you saw me present on. And when we do share data out from that big pool to CTDC or in a context like this, as you can see, we remove obviously all the identifiers is at such a high level, you're not going to really see the individual information that's enough to identify them. But I want to make a bigger philosophical point, this idea that people want so much protection, we want our private information to be kept secret. It's actually a really Western privilege idea. We actually talk to people who are trying to get assistance. They are Nepalese stuck in the Gulf states. They don't even have an ID card. No one's trying to sell them a magazine. They're like, I don't care if people know my name. I want somebody to know my name because I'm stuck here. So this idea that like not all victims are just trying to stay anonymous is not necessarily the case. If sometimes we need to share data to make sure impact is made on their behalf, we should do that rather than just be like, let's never share any data because it's all victim information. It's all so sensitive and we must protect, every identifying mark about them at all costs. I do think sometimes we do stray into that territory because it's informed by a different perspective than the lived experience of, unfortunately, the survivors, where they want there to be more information about them existing in the system, because the reason they're vulnerable is because there is no information about them in the system that we all take for granted. So that's kind of a tangential point about from my perspective.
I'd actually like to underscore that point. We have a database that has been collated from lots of different groups. It has tens of thousands of victims in it, and people share their databases with us all the time. And it's quite simple to anonymize these data. I mean, and what we're really interested is the names of the individuals are not at all important for 95% of the work we're looking at. Typically, we're trying to find what are the characteristics of these people, how did they become associated with human trafficking, what were some of the indicators that we can look at that would provide us an assessment of their vulnerability and why they were vulnerable. But to have these large data sets where they aren't being shared because there's personal data in there, and not just anonymizing these data so that they can be used, I think is frankly limiting a lot of the work we're doing, and is sometimes being used as an excuse not to share data. And I think we have to get over that. And I think these data, it's straightforward to anonymize it. There are many ways to do it, and that should not be used as a reason not to share these data sets.
Thank you so much. I know we have 5 minutes left, and we just lost Davina to her next panel, which again, I encourage everyone to join. It's going to be a really interesting counterpart to this one. Do we have, there are a couple of comments in the chat. One is about the difficulty of avoiding duplication. And I think, Jinyi, that goes to your point about training frontline data collectors. We had a point about how not only is it true that the plural of anecdote is not data, it's also true that a site visit is not an ethnographic yes. Research. I don't know if anyone would like to speak more to that point. I think, Greg, whenever you bring up epistemological frameworks, we start to see how they really do shape how we approach data and how even we talk about it and use terms. I'm not seeing any final questions from anyone, in which case I'm going to exert some moderator privilege and ask both of you if you see any tension between, Greg, to your point about we have plenty of data, we need to really start using some of the methods that we have, and Jinyi, your earlier point about the assumptions that are baked into a lot of the data we have. So as just sort of a final closing point, if each of you could maybe speak to that a little. And in case I don't have time to speak again, I really want to thank both of you and Davina for this fascinating conversation. And I really want to thank all of the participants. And I hope it's been as enjoyable for you as it has been for me. Thank you. Greg or Shinyi, any final thoughts?
Oh, I was gonna like Greg, but yeah, I can definitely take that first. So I completely, I think, am sympathetic. I think there's a lot more methodological ground we just haven't explored in trafficking. We kind of use the same methods over and over again and fine tune kind of the same conclusions. But that said, I came in with a quant background, and now I'm totally into like, let's do the basics first, because I couldn't even figure out how to apply my skills. When I first got hired as a data scientist in Hong Kong, I was like, they don't need a data scientist, they need a technologist, because people don't even have systems to record information. And that's why I'm now the CTO of Liberty Share, because we realized putting down infrastructure and putting down ways of collecting primary data was key. Because I think we, again, living in a Western perspective, we're drowning in data. It's a data rich world, but see it from the eye of the person on the ground living in the labor camp, and they don't even have a way to get in touch with their family. They're not on telephones. I don't know how Gallup in the world would reach them. I mean, I talked to people at Gallup about this. They are mostly a firm doing political polling and polling about consumer demand. And if you have no money and can't spend anything on new fridges, Gallup is not set up to reach you. So, you know, to Davina's point, that they understand that's a limitation. So I think there is such a lack of the digital divide between data capture for privileged, you know, well-lived lives versus those who are vulnerable is huge. And you know, I hear from Greg, I hear from Davina that they're trying to do more data collection. And I do think that's where we need to put some of our efforts and some of our coordination. And also to Greg's point, we need to start sharing some of those outputs and not just let, oh, if we do like perfect differential privacy, we can somehow figure out who this person is. If we like figure out their age and their village they came from and when they got trafficked, we'll de-anonymize them. Like, let's put those concerns aside, because they need their information out there. They need their stories heard, so we can actually move forward to addressing their systems of vulnerability, which is why they got exploited in the first place. So, yeah.
I think also the problem that we're looking at here is not one that's unique to CTIP. I mean, there's always this, when you want to look at a problem, your immediate reaction is to go out and conduct a new survey for that, you know, and collect data. You know, it's not to go and look at what data are available. And I think we need to rethink that. You know, especially today in such a data-rich environment. I mean, look at, you know, the example that Shani was just saying. You know, we can use remote sensing to get very accurate estimates in areas where people aren't on communication networks. But we can use that data to get estimates of income levels, demographic data, age distributions, you know, access to markets, educational facilities. All of that can be done at very high resolution. You know, the idea of sending people out in the field, it's very expensive. It's time consuming, it can be dangerous, and often the results that we get are heavily biased. I mean, look at the United States polling data. You know, this should not be the first thing we do. It should be kind of the last thing we do. And of course, funding institutions are, you know, it's always more exciting to fund a new survey than it is to go back and take advantage of all these data that are out there and look at new analytical approaches to integrate those data and come up with new insights from existing data. So this is not unique to CTIP. This is something that every field of science is struggling with right now.
Agree, yeah.
Thank you both so much. And again, thank you to our audience. This has been fascinating. I see that Shinyi and Davina have put their contact information in the chat. Greg, if you're willing to do so, that would be great so that people can follow up with you. And just a reminder, these sessions are all recorded. So again, thank you for your attention and for joining the Evidence to Action Summit. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a good one.
Thank you for attending the Evidence to Action Summit and today's session on big data. Please do join us in other sessions in this summit. All registered participants have received calendar invites and a participant's guide to all sessions at the summit. The next session will be assessing vulnerability to forced labor and human trafficking, starting now, or actually about 2 minutes ago. We'll also have effectiveness of counter-trafficking interventions taking place in 13 minutes. Please continue the conversation in the conference community on MS Teams, especially if you are interested in finding collaborators for the pitch competition being offered through participation in the Evidence to Action Summit. Thank you again for your participation, our moderator and our panelists. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of your sessions.